The Paseo de la Reforma in Mexico City is a boulevard designed to intimidate. A wide river of asphalt, flanked by statues of dead heroes and the imposing architecture of foreign powers. But on the morning of January 6, 1977, it smelled mostly of diesel fumes and desperation. Andrew Daulton Lee stood on the sidewalk, vibrating with a chemical anxiety that had nothing to do with the altitude. He was 25 years old, thick-bodied, with a face scarred by bad skin and eyes that darted behind wire-rimmed glasses like trapped insects. He was sweating through his shirt, a cold, clammy perspiration that signaled the beginning of heroin withdrawal. To the casual observer, he looked like a lost tourist or a vagrant who had wandered too far from the Zona Rosa. But the Mexican police officer leaning against a wall across the street saw something else. He saw a man who was terrified. Lee had been pacing the perimeter of the Soviet embassy for hours. The embassy was a fortress, a massive compound of high walls and cameras that served as the nerve center for KGB operations in Latin America. Lee was trying to get in, but the gates remained shut. He was a drug dealer from the wealthy suburbs of California, a man used to the transactional ease of the black market. But he was failing to understand the rigid bureaucracy of espionage. He had missed a meeting, or perhaps the Soviets were ignoring him, tired of his erratic behavior and his demands for more money. The paranoia in Lee's mind was deafening. He felt the eyes of the CIA on his back. He felt the sickness rising in his gut, and he made a decision born of pure panic. He walked up to the heavy iron fence, in a gesture of frantic frustration, pulled a small white object from his pocket and threw it through the bars. It was a marker, a signal, a plea for attention. The police officer pushed himself off the wall. In the chaotic ecosystem of Mexico City, littering was a minor sin, but throwing objects into a diplomatic compound was a behavior that demanded a conversation. The officer crossed the wide avenue, dodging the erratic traffic of Volkswagen Beetles and buses. He grabbed Lee by the arm. The American flinched violently, his body rigid with the expectation of violence. The officer spoke in rapid Spanish, demanding identification, demanding to know what he was doing. Lee stammered, his Spanish broken and panicked. He tried to pull away. The officer slammed him against the rough stone of a nearby wall and began to pat him down. He expected to find a knife, or perhaps a bag of marijuana. What he found was a Minix B subminiature camera, a device so small it could be hidden in a closed fist, and a plastic bag filled with unexposed film. And then, deep in the pocket of Lee's jacket, his fingers closed around a stack of paper strips. The officer pulled them out and held them up to the relentless Mexican sun. They were strips of microfilm, dark negatives that captured images of typed documents. The officer could not read the technical English jargon, nor did he understand the physics of high-frequency radio waves or orbital mechanics, but he recognized the stamps that marked the top and bottom of every page. Top secret, Umbra, Noffer. The officer looked at the sweating, shivering gringo in his grip. This was not a tourist. This was not a junkie looking for a fix, though he was that too. This was something that could get a man promoted or killed. He clicked the handcuffs onto Andrew Daulton Lee's wrists and shoved him into the back of his patrol car. The siren wailed, cutting through the smog, carrying the Snowman away. He had just inadvertently dismantled the most damaging spy ring of the decade because he couldn't keep his hands in his pockets. To understand how a drug dealer ended up holding the blueprints to the CIA's most advanced spy satellite on a street corner in Mexico, one must look thousands of miles north, to a place that was the polar opposite of the chaotic, dirty streets of the District Federal. Palos Verdes, California, was a peninsula of silence and money. It was a community built on the cliffs overlooking the Pacific Ocean, an enclave where the executives of the aerospace industry built sprawling ranch houses and raised their children in a bubble of privilege. It was the American dream realized in stucco and manicured lawns. But by the mid-1970s, A strange rot had set in at the heart of this paradise. The children of the men who had built the missiles and the bombers were bored. They were the first generation to grow up in the shadow of the Vietnam War and Watergate, and they looked at their father's world not with admiration, but with a deep, corrosive cynicism. Christopher Boyce was the prince of this dissatisfaction. He was the eldest son of Charles Boyce, a former FBI agent who had transitioned into corporate security for McDonnell Douglas. Christopher was brilliant, possessing a tested IQ of 142 and a mind that devoured history and politics. He was an altar boy at St. John Fisher Catholic Church, polite to the neighbors, and outwardly the perfect son. But internally, he was adrift. He despised the suburban conformity of Palos Verdes. He felt no connection to the surf culture or the shallow materialism of his peers. Instead, he retreated into the ancient, solitary world of falconry. He spent his days in the rugged canyons of the peninsula, training hawks and falcons to hunt. He admired the birds for their purity. They were predators, yes, but they were honest predators. They killed to eat. They didn't lie. They didn't bomb villages in Southeast Asia while preaching about democracy. It was in this vacuum of alienation that Boyce bonded with Andrew Daulton Lee. They were an unlikely pair. Boyce was the intellectual, the reader, the moralist. Lee was the hustler. Adopted son of a wealthy doctor, Lee was physically small, insecure, and desperate for validation. While Boyce rebelled by reading about the CIA's covert wars, Lee rebelled by selling drugs. He started with marijuana in high school and quickly graduated to cocaine and heroin. He became the Snowman, the go-to dealer for the bored rich kids of the peninsula. Boyce and Lee were drawn together by their shared status as outsiders. They would spend hours in Boyce's room, smoking pot and drinking, reinforcing each other's view that the world was corrupt and that the rules didn't apply to them. Boyce provided the philosophy. Lee provided the chemicals. By 1974, Christopher Boyce had dropped out of college. He was 21 years old, directionless, and spending too much time with his birds. His father, worried about his son's future and unaware of the depth of his son's radicalization, decided to intervene. Charles Boyce called in a favor. He had an old friend from his FBI days who worked in security at TRW, an aerospace giant headquartered in nearby Redondo Beach. TRW was the contractor that built the engines for the ICBMs, the lunar landers for NASA, and the black projects for the CIA. Charles asked if there was a job for his boy. Based solely on his father's reputation, Christopher Boyce was hired. He wasn't interviewed by a psychologist. His friends weren't questioned about his anti-government rants. He was simply processed. In a matter of weeks, a college dropout with a history of drug use and a deep hatred for the U.S. government was granted a top-secret PER, Special Background Investigation clearance. Boyce was assigned to work in Building M4, a nondescript concrete structure in an industrial park that housed the Black Vault. This was a sensitive compartmented information facility, a room designed to be impenetrable to spies. It was the nerve center for the CIA's communication with its clandestine satellite constellations. When Boyce swiped his badge and walked through the heavy steel door for the first time, he expected to enter a world of steely-eyed professionals, a high-tech fortress staffed by patriots. What he found was a frat house. The vault was staffed almost entirely by young men in their early 20s, many of them nepotism hires like himself. They were paid barely above minimum wage to handle the most sensitive secrets on the planet, and they treated the responsibility with a shocking lack of seriousness. The culture inside the Black Vault was a grotesque parody of national security. Because the room was sealed off from the rest of the company janitors, and regular security guards were not allowed inside, the employees lived in a zone of total impunity. Boyce watched in amazement as his colleagues mixed daiquiris in the classified document shredders. They discovered that if you put rum, bananas, and ice into the heavy-duty industrial shredder intended for cryptographic codes, it produced a passable cocktail. They kept bottles of vodka and peppermint schnapps hidden in the ceiling tiles and inside the hollow casings of the cryptographic machines. They smoked marijuana during the night shift, blowing the smoke into the air filtration vents to disperse the smell. They hosted parties inside the vault on weekends, bringing in girlfriends to have sex on the desks where the nuclear war plans were processed. The classified documents themselves were treated like trash. Cables marked with code words like Rylite, Argus, and Pyramid were left lying on desks, stained with coffee rings. Code books that were supposed to be locked in safes were left out overnight. Boyce realized very quickly that the security of the American intelligence apparatus was a myth. It was a hollow shell, rotted from the inside by arrogance and negligence. His job was to act as a communications clerk. He operated the cryptographic teletypes. Messages would come in from the CIA headquarters in Langley. Encrypted, the machines would decrypt them. Boyce would print them out, log them, and distribute them to the engineers. Then he would take the outgoing messages from the TRW scientists, encrypt them, and send them back to the CIA. He was the filter. Every secret passed through his hands. At first, Boyce was merely amused by the incompetence around him. It confirmed his cynical view of the system. But as the months went by, he began to read the messages. He wasn't supposed to read the content, only process the transmission, but curiosity got the better of him. What he read shattered him. The vault was the hub for the Rylite project. Rylite was a top-secret surveillance satellite manufactured by TRW. It was a massive dish antenna parked in geosynchronous orbit 22,000 miles above the Earth. Its job was to intercept Soviet telemetry. When the Russians test-fired a nuclear missile, the missile broadcast data back to the Soviet engineer's speed, fuel burn, warhead separation. Rylite sucked up those signals and beamed them to a ground station in Pine Gap, Australia. It was the primary way the United States verified that the Soviets were adhering to arms control treaties. But Boyce saw other cables. He saw traffic indicating that the CIA was not just spying on the Soviets. They were spying on allies. He found cables detailing how the agency was infiltrating labor unions in Australia. He found evidence that the CIA was working to destabilize the government of Australian Prime Minister Gough Whitlam, a democratically elected leader who had threatened to close the U.S. spy base at Pine Gap. To Christopher Boyce, this was the smoking gun. This wasn't national defense. This was imperialism. He felt a righteous, burning anger. He looked at the careless young men around him, drinking schnapps and laughing while the CIA toppled governments, and he decided to act. He wouldn't just quit. He would punish them. He would take the secrets they treated like trash and weaponize them. In early 1975, Boyce invited Andrew Daulton Lee to a party. They sat in the living room of a house in Palos Verdes, drinking beer as the sun went down over the ocean. Boyce was agitated, his mind racing with the enormity of what he was considering. He lowered his voice. He told Lee that he worked in a place where the CIA sent messages. He told him that he knew things. He told him that the government was lying to the people. Lee listened, but he didn't care about Australia. He didn't care about Gough Whitlam or the morality of foreign policy. But he cared about the intensity in Boyce's eyes. And then Boyce dropped the bomb. He said he wanted to send this information to the Russians. He said he wanted to show the world what the CIA was really doing. But he couldn't do it himself. He was inside. He needed a courier. Lee's eyes lit up. He saw an angle. He asked if the Russians paid. Boyce, clinging to his moral high ground, said he didn't want money. He just wanted to hurt the CIA. Lee countered immediately. He said he wanted money. He said he could do it. He had connections in Mexico City from his drug runs. He could walk into the embassy. He could make the deal. It was a pact made in hell. The Falcon would steal the secrets. The Snowman would sell them. Boyce agreed to the terms. Lee could keep the money, as long as the information got to the KGB. Boyce convinced himself he was a whistleblower, using Lee as a necessary evil. Lee convinced himself he was a supercriminal, using Boyce as a gold mine. The mechanics of the theft were laughably simple. Security at TRW was focused on people getting in, not what they took out. There were no searches of employees leaving the vault. Boyce began to stay late, when he was alone in the vault or when his coworkers were passed out or drunk. He would take the code books and the technical manuals for the Rylite satellite. He would place them on the floor and photograph them with a Menex camera he had bought. Sometimes he didn't even bother with the camera. He would just shove the documents into his jacket or hide them in the bottom of a potted plant that he would carry out to his car, claiming the plant needed some sun. He would drive to a 7-Eleven, use a public Xerox machine to copy top-secret cryptographic keys while buying a Slurpee, and then drive back to TRW and put the originals back in the safe before anyone noticed. It was that easy. Andrew Daulton Lee's first trip to Mexico City in 1975 was a comedy of errors that somehow succeeded. He walked into the Soviet embassy wearing a trench coat, looking like a caricature of a spy from a bad movie. He was terrified. When he finally met a consular officer, he slapped a stack of technical manuals on the desk. The Soviets were skeptical. They thought he was an FBI plant. A drug dealer with satellite blueprints? It didn't make sense. But when they sent the documents to Moscow for analysis, the KGB Technical Directorate was stunned. These were the real keys to the Pyramid project, a theoretical stealth satellite system, and the ciphers for the Rylite data links. The KGB assigned a handler to Lee. They gave him a code name. They gave him training on how to check for surveillance, which he mostly ignored. And they gave him money, thousands of dollars in cash per trip. Lee would fly back to California, flush with cash, and buy more heroin. He told Boyce the Russians were thrilled and wanted more. For 2 years, the pipeline was wide open. Boyce grew bolder. He stole the key lists for the KW7 encryption machines. This allowed the Soviets to decrypt the daily traffic of the CIA. He stole the specifications for the satellite sensors. He was gutting the American intelligence capability from the inside out, driven by a mix of political rage and the thrill of getting away with it. But the entropy of the drug life began to erode the operation. Lee was deteriorating. The heroin was eating his mind. He started arriving late to meetings. He started demanding more money, threatening the KGB agents that he would cut them off if they didn't pay up. The Soviets, who valued discipline above all else, began to view Lee as a liability. They tried to persuade him to bring Boyce to Mexico so they could deal with the source directly, but Lee refused. He knew that if the Soviets met Boyce, the articulate, intelligent source, they would cut Lee out of the loop. Lee needed to be the gatekeeper. By January 1977, the situation was critical. Boyce, sitting in the vault in Redondo Beach, had just photographed the most sensitive document yet, the detailed study of the Pyramid project. He gave the film to Lee. He warned him to be careful. He told him this was big. Lee nodded, sweating, already thinking about the fix he would buy in Mexico City. Lee flew to Mexico. He went to his hotel. He shot up. He waited for his signal. But the KGB was tired of his antics. They didn't show up. The paranoia set in. Lee paced his room. He paced the street. And then, driven by the madness of withdrawal, he walked to the embassy gate and threw his marker through the fence. The Mexican police officer watching from across the street didn't know about the Falcons, the daiquiris in the shredder, or the Prime Minister of Australia. He just saw a litterbug. And as he clicked the handcuffs onto Andrew Daulton Lee's wrists, he had no idea he was effectively arresting the eyes and ears of the United States government. The Snowman was in custody, and back in Palos Verdes, the Falcon was cleaning his bird cages, unaware that the sky was about to fall. The basement of the Directorate of Federal Security in Mexico City was a place where the concept of civil rights did not exist. A subterranean world of concrete and fluorescent lights that buzzed with the menace of state-sanctioned violence. Andrew Daulton Lee sat handcuffed to a metal chair, his body shivering violently as the heroin left his system, replaced by a raw, screaming panic that felt like his bones were trying to escape his skin. The room smelled of stale tobacco smoke, unwashed bodies, and the metallic tongue of dried blood, a sensory assault that compounded the terror of the young American drug dealer. He was no longer the Snowman, the swaggering kingpin of the Palos Verdes high school scene. He was a terrified 25-year-old junkie who had stumbled into a geopolitical meat grinder. The agents standing over him were not like the police officers in California. They were men who fought the dirty war against leftist guerrillas, men who viewed interrogation not as a legal process, but as a physical one. They didn't care about his right to an attorney. They cared about the microfilm. The DFS agents had laid the contents of Lee's pockets onto a metal table. The Minex camera, the cipher pads, and the strips of film stamped with top-secret warnings. They looked at the items, and then they looked at Lee. They slapped him, not with the theatrical open hand of a movie villain, but with the hard, stinging efficiency of professionals who wanted answers quickly. They demanded to know who he was. They demanded to know who his contact was at the Soviet embassy. Lee tried to lie. He tried to bluster about being a tourist, about having rights, but the withdrawal was stripping away his ability to deceive. His mind was fracturing. The pain in his joints was excruciating, and the fear of the Mexican prison system, a place he knew only from nightmares, broke his resolve completely. He began to sob. He began to talk. He didn't just confess. He purged. He told them everything, vomiting up the secrets of the last 2 years in a desperate attempt to make the pain stop. He told them he was a spy. He told them he worked for the KGB. He shouted that if they called the Soviet embassy, the Russians would come and get him, that they would pay the police money, anything to get him out of that room. But the Mexican agents were confused. A drug addict with high-level satellite schematics? It didn't make sense. They pressed harder. Where did you get the documents? You are too stupid to steal these. Who gave them to you? And in that moment of ultimate weakness, Andrew Daulton Lee betrayed his best friend. He gave up the ghost. He stammered the name that would doom them both. Christopher Boyce. He works at TRW. He's the source. He's the one you want. The revelation changed the temperature in the room. The Mexican agents realized they were holding a hand grenade with the pin pulled. This wasn't a local crime. This was an international incident. They contacted the legal attaché at the United States Embassy, the FBI's representative in Mexico City. When the FBI agents arrived at the police station and saw the evidence, the mood shifted from skepticism to absolute horror. They put a loop to the microfilm Lee had been carrying. They saw the diagrams of the Pure Matter project. They saw the frequency charts for the Rylite data links. These were code word documents, the holy grail of the National Security Agency, material so sensitive that only a handful of people in the Pentagon were supposed to know it existed. And here it was, stained with the sweat of a heroin addict in a Mexico City basement. The clock began to tick. The FBI agents knew they had to get Lee back to the United States immediately. If he was formally charged in Mexico, he could disappear into their legal system for years. Or worse, the Soviets might try to intervene. But there was a problem. Extradition was a slow, bureaucratic process that took months. They didn't have months. They had hours. Every minute Lee sat in that cell was a minute Christopher Boyce remained free in California, capable of fleeing, destroying evidence, or passing more secrets. A deal was struck in the shadows, a handshake agreement between the FBI and the Mexican authorities that bypassed the courts entirely. The Mexicans agreed to deport Lee as an undesirable alien. It was a legal fiction, a rendition disguised as immigration enforcement. On the evening of January 15, 1977, a convoy of unmarked cars raced Lee to the Mexico City airport. He was dazed, hallucinating, and terrified, sandwiched between agents who refused to speak to him. He was marched onto a plane bound for Laredo, Texas. The flight was a surreal limbo. Lee sat in his seat, vibrating with withdrawal, watching the lights of Mexico fade beneath him, unaware that he was leaving the free world forever. When the plane touched down in Texas, the charade ended. As soon as Lee's foot hit the tarmac, FBI agents were waiting. They didn't welcome him home. They arrested him for espionage. But the arrest of the Snowman was only the opening move. The real target was 1,500 miles away, sleeping in a rented house near the University of California, Riverside. Sunday morning, January 16, 1977, dawned bright and clear in Southern California. The Santa Ana winds had scrubbed the smog from the air, leaving the sky a piercing, brilliant blue. Christopher Boyce was 23 years old, and he was sitting in his driveway, unaware that his life was effectively over. He had noticed that Daulton was late returning from Mexico. There had been a twinge of anxiety, a subtle tightening in his chest, but Boyce had pushed it down. He was arrogant. He believed in his own intellectual superiority. He believed that he and Daulton were operating on a plane of reality that the clumsy bureaucrats of the FBI could not touch. He was planning a falconry trip. He was worried about his birds. He was thinking about the history paper he needed to write. He was living in a compartmentalized delusion where he could be a student by day and a Soviet asset by night. As he walked toward his car, carrying a bag of groceries, he saw the sedans turn onto his street. They were large, dark American government cars, and they moved with a purpose that shattered the suburban quiet. They didn't slow down to park. They swarmed. Men in suits jumped out, weapons drawn, moving with the precision of a tactical team that expects resistance. Boyce froze. He held the grocery bag in his arms, a carton of milk and a loaf of bread, the mundane artifacts of a free man. He watched them come. He didn't run. He didn't reach for a weapon. In that split second, the fantasy of the Falcon evaporated. The intellectual justifications, the anger at the CIA, the thrill of the secret life, it all turned to ash. He was just a kid who had been caught. The lead agent approached him, badge raised, gun leveled. Christopher Boyce. FBI, hands in the air. Boyce dropped the groceries. He raised his hands. He looked at the agent with a face that showed no surprise, only a deep, weary resignation. "I've been expecting you," he said. It was a line from a movie, a final attempt to salvage some dignity, to frame himself as a martyr rather than a criminal. They cuffed him against the hood of the car. As they shoved him into the back seat, Boyce didn't ask for a lawyer. He asked the only question that mattered. "Did you get Lee?" The agents didn't answer him, but the silence confirmed everything. The Snowman had melted, and the floodwaters had come for them both. The interrogation of Christopher Boyce at the FBI field office in Los Angeles was less a battle of wills and more a confessional flood. Unlike Lee, who had to be broken by the threat of a Mexican prison, Boyce was eager to talk. He wanted to explain. He wanted to contextualize his actions. He sat across from the agents, articulate and calm, and tried to lecture them on geopolitics. He told them he hadn't done it for the money, though he had taken plenty of it. He told them he did it because of Australia. He told them about the cables he had seen in the Black Vault, the evidence that the CIA was manipulating the labor unions in Canberra and undermining the Whitlam government. He spoke with the passion of a convert, trying to convince the FBI agents that he was the moral actor in this tragedy, and that the government was the villain. The FBI agents listened stonily. They weren't interested in his political philosophy. They were interested in the damage assessment. They laid out the photos of the documents Ley had been carrying. They asked him what else he had given to the Soviets. Boyce, believing that total honesty might validate his whistleblower narrative, began to list the documents. And as he spoke, the blood drained from the faces of the agents in the room. He told them he had given the KGB the Rylite manuals. He told them he had photographed the Argus project specifications. He told them he had handed over the cipher keys for the KW7 encryption machines. The agents had to stop the interview to call Washington. This was the moment the scale of the disaster truly hit the U.S. intelligence community. This wasn't just a leak. It was a hemorrhaging artery. The Rylite satellites were the eyes and ears of the Western world. Parked in geosynchronous orbit, they listened to the microwave signals that controlled the Soviet nuclear arsenal. They were the only way the U.S. knew if the Soviets were cheating on the SALT treaties. By giving the Soviets the technical manuals, Boyce hadn't just told them what the U.S. knew. He had told them how the U.S. knew it. He had revealed the frequencies, the blind spots, the processing capabilities. The reaction at the NSA headquarters at Fort Meade was panic. If the Soviets knew the Rylite frequencies, they could simply change their transmission bands. They could encrypt their telemetry. They could feed the satellites false data. The window into the Soviet missile program had been smashed. The CI estimated that this single betrayal set U.S. intelligence efforts back by 5 to 10 years and cost billions of dollars to fix. But the interrogation revealed something that humiliated the CIA and TRW even more than the theft itself. Boyce described the culture of the Black Vault. He described the code word, area place that required a special background investigation, the highest level of trust in the government, as a playground for bored teenagers. He told the agents about the daiquiris. He explained how he and his colleagues would buy rum and bananas, sneak them into the vault, and mix them in the heavy-duty document shredder. He told them about the pot parties during the night shift, about how they would blow marijuana smoke into the air filtration vents so the guards outside wouldn't smell it. He described courier runs where sensitive codes were left on the dashboard of a car while he grabbed a burger. He told them how he smuggled documents out in potted plants, carrying the plant past the guards who smiled and waved. He painted a picture of a security apparatus that was a hollow shell, rotted from the inside by negligence and arrogance. The FBI agents realized, with sinking dread, that they were partially responsible. They had cleared these kids. They had trusted the Boyce name. They had failed to see the rot in Palos Verdes because it looked so much like the American dream. The trial of Christopher Boyce and Andrew Daulton Lee began in May 1977 in Los Angeles, and it quickly became a media circus. The press dubbed them the Falcon and the Snowman, a moniker that lent a dangerous, cinematic romance to their crimes. But inside the courtroom, there was no romance. There was only the brutal friction of two friends turning on each other to survive. The defense strategies were diametrically opposed, reflecting the divergent personalities of the two men. Andrew Daulton Lee, facing life in prison without parole, claimed he was innocent. His lawyers argued that his confession in Mexico City had been obtained under torture, a claim that was almost certainly true given the reputation of the DFS, but was undermined by the physical evidence found in his pocket. They tried to paint him as a hapless victim of Boyce's manipulation, a drug addict who didn't know what he was carrying, a mule who thought he was smuggling industrial trade secrets, not nuclear codes. Lee sat at the defense table, twitching, pale, looking like a man watching his life dissolve into a gray mist. Christopher Boyce took a gamble that terrified the U.S. government. He admitted to the acts. He didn't deny stealing the documents. Instead, he tried to put the CIA on trial. He wanted to use the courtroom as a platform to expose the agency's illegal activities in Australia. His defense was necessity, the legal argument that a crime is justified if it is committed to prevent a greater harm. He argued that the CIA's subversion of a democratic ally was the greater harm, and that he was morally obligated to expose it. He wanted to call CIA witnesses. He wanted to introduce classified cables about the overthrow of the Australian government. He wanted to turn his treason trial into a public airing of the Cold War's dirty laundry. The prosecutors panic. They invoked the state secrets privilege. The judge, sympathetic to the government's national security concerns, ruled that the CIA's activities in Australia were irrelevant to the charges of espionage. Boyce was gagged. His whistleblower defense was stripped away, leaving him naked before the jury as a simple traitor. The prosecution hammered the financial angle, dismantling Boyce's claims of moral purity. If you were a whistleblower, the prosecutor asked, why did you take $77,000 from the KGB? Why didn't you go to the New York Times? Why did you go to the Soviet embassy? Boyce had no good answer. The idealism crumbled under the weight of the cash. The jury saw him not as a hero, but as a spoiled, arrogant young man who had sold his country to buy falconry equipment and fund his friend's drug habit. The verdict was a foregone conclusion, but the sentencing was the final nail in the coffin of their youth. Andrew Daulton Lee was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison. Christopher Boyce was found guilty and sentenced to 40 years. As the bailiffs led them away, the two friends didn't look at each other. The partnership was over. The Falcon was grounded, his wings clipped by the weight of federal prison. The Snowman was heading to a cage where he would likely die. The intelligence community breathed a sigh of relief. The leak was plugged. The bad apples were discarded. They assumed the story was over. They assumed that Christopher Boyce, the soft intellectual from the suburbs, would wither and die in the harsh environment of the penitentiary. They were wrong. Christopher Boyce was not built for captivity. He was a creature of the open sky. As the heavy steel doors of the federal penitentiary in Lompoc slammed shut behind him, his mind didn't turn to repentance. It turned to geometry. He looked at the fences. He looked at the towers. He looked at the guards. And he began to calculate. The Falcon was already planning his next flight. If you are finding this deep dive into the shadow world of Cold War espionage compelling, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel. Your support allows us to continue excavating these forgotten files and bringing you the true stories that history books often overlook. The geometry of the Federal Correctional Institution at Lompoc, California, is a study in containment. A grid of concrete and chain link designed to impose order on the chaotic lives of men who have broken the law. To the Bureau of Prisons, it was a medium security facility, a warehouse for non-violent offenders and white-collar criminals that earned the derisive nickname Club Fed. But for Christopher Boyce, it was a tomb. He had spent 3 years staring at the same angles, the same gray walls, and the same stretch of sky intersected by razor wire. He was 26 years old, serving a 40-year sentence for selling the secrets of the Rylite satellite system to the Soviet Union. The intellectual arrogance that had fueled his treason in the Palos Verdes suburbs had been ground down by the monotony of incarceration. He was no longer the Falcon. He was inmate 76193-012, a number in a ledger, watching his life evaporate one count at a time. But captivity had sharpened Boyce's senses in a way the guards failed to appreciate. He had reverted to his true nature, the falconer. In the wild, a predator survives by noticing the smallest deviations in the environment, the twitch of a rabbit's ear, the shift in the wind. In prison, Boyce applied this predatory gaze to the security apparatus itself. He spent his recreation time in the yard, not lifting weights or playing basketball, but watching. He watched the rotation of the guards in the towers. He timed the sweep of the xenon searchlights that cut through the coastal fog. He studied the topography of the perimeter with the obsession of a cartographer. And in that study, he found a flaw. The flaw was a drainage ditch. It was a concrete culvert near the back of the facility, designed to channel rainwater away from the prison grounds. Boyce noticed that the ground around the ditch dipped slightly, creating a blind spot. When the searchlights swept the fence line at night, the beam passed over the depression, leaving the bottom of the ditch in total darkness for a span of about 6 seconds. It was a negligible error, a minor oversight by an architect who never imagined a man would risk his life on a 6-second margin. But to Boyce, that shadow was a door. He didn't have a sophisticated support team. He didn't have a KGB extraction squad waiting with a helicopter. He had a pair of tin snips he had stolen from the prison hobby shop, hidden in his waistband, and a crude ladder fashioned from tree branches and scrap wood that he had scavenged from the yard and buried under a pile of rotting leaves in the ditch. On the evening of January 21st, 1980, the elements conspired to aid the traitor. A heavy, suffocating fog rolled in off the Pacific Ocean, blanketing the prison in a wet gray mist that diffused the floodlights and muffled sound. It was the perfect screen. During the evening recreation period, while the yard buzzed with the low-level tension of 1,000 confined men, Boyce slipped away from the group. He moved with the quiet efficiency of a ghost, sliding into the drainage ditch and pressing his body into the mud. He covered himself with the debris he had staged there, dead leaves, trash, and dirt, and waited. He lay there for hours as the recreation period ended and the other inmates were marched back to their cells. He listened to the heavy boots of the patrol guards, crunching on the gravel path just feet above his head. He controlled his breathing, forcing his heart rate down, knowing that a single cough or a shift in the leaves would mean another decade added to his sentence. When the final count was conducted inside the cell blocks, the alarm was raised. Boyce was missing. The siren began to wail, a mechanical scream that tore through the fog. But the confusion worked in his favor. While the guards scrambled to search the cells and the common areas, assuming he was hiding inside, Boyce made his move. He crawled to the perimeter fence. The tin snips were dull, tearing the galvanized steel mesh rather than cutting it cleanly. Snap, snap. The sound seemed deafening to him, like gunshots in a library, but the siren drowned it out. He cut a hole just big enough to squeeze his shoulders through. He checked the light. Sweep ... darkness. He scrambled through the jagged opening, tearing his prison uniform, and sprinted across the open ground of the perimeter. He didn't look back. He reached the cover of a eucalyptus grove, the scent of the trees filling his lungs with the sharp, cold air of freedom. He ran until his legs burned, disappearing into the rugged hills of the California coast, leaving the Falcon's cage empty. The escape of a convicted Soviet spy was a catastrophic embarrassment for the Department of Justice. The Cold War was entering a new, dangerous freeze following the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, and the idea that the man who knew the technical secrets of American satellite surveillance was loose on U.S. soil was a nightmare scenario. The U.S. Marshal Service launched the largest manhunt in its history, mobilizing hundreds of agents, helicopters, and dogs. The profiling unit at the FBI headquarters in Quantico began to build a predictive model of Boyce's movements. They looked at his profile, a wealthy kid from Southern California, a lover of comfort, a man with deep ties to Mexico through his partner Andrew Daulton Lee. The logic was sound, but it was wrong. The marshals assumed Boyce would head south. They saturated the border crossings at Tijuana and San Isidro. They staked out the Soviet embassy in Mexico City and the consulate in San Francisco, assuming he would try to defect to Moscow. They tapped the phones of his parents and friends in Palos Verdes, waiting for the inevitable call for money. But Christopher Boyce had no intention of going to the Soviets. He knew better than anyone that to the KGB, he was a burned asset, a liability. He was alone in the world. So, instead of going south to the heat and the cartels, he went north. He hitchhiked his way up the spine of California, sleeping in ditches and stealing food from grocery stores. moving through the shadowy underbelly of the American highway system. He drifted into the Pacific Northwest, a landscape of dense forests, rain, and isolation that perfectly matched his internal state. He arrived in northern Idaho, in a remote logging town called Bonner's Ferry, just south of the Canadian border. It was a place where people went to get lost, a haven for survivalists, drifters, and men who wanted to be left alone. Boyce shed his identity like a snake shedding its skin. He cut his hair. He grew a thick, unkempt beard. He adopted the alias Anthony Lester. He rented a dilapidated cabin in the woods, a shack with no electricity and no running water. He chopped wood to keep from freezing. He hunted for food. The brilliant young man who had once mixed cocktails in the Black Vault and discussed geopolitics with KGB agents was now living the life of a 19th century mountain man. For a few months, Boyce found a strange, grim peace in the wilderness. He was free from the geometry of the prison. He spent his days hiking in the Selkirk Mountains, watching the raptors hunt, reconnecting with the natural world that had always been his only true religion. But the reality of survival is brutal. The winter was cold, and the solitude was maddening. But the most pressing problem was money. Boyce was starving. He had no job skills that were relevant in a logging town. He couldn't go to a bank and open an account. He was an intellectual fugitive with a genius IQ and an empty stomach. The hunger gnawed at him, stripping away the last vestiges of his moral pretensions. He realized that to survive, he couldn't be a passive observer of nature. He had to become a predator again. The transformation of Christopher Boyce from a cerebral spy into a hardened bank robber is one of the most bizarre chapters in the history of American crime. It defied all psychological profiling. Spies usually deal in deception and information. Bank robbers deal in terror and kinetic violence. But Boyce approached bank robbery with the same analytical detachment he had used to steal the Rylite manuals. He viewed the bank not as a community institution, but as a system with vulnerabilities. He purchased a .357 Magnum revolver and a sawed-off shotgun from a private seller who didn't ask for ID. He went to a costume shop and bought a collection of disguises wigs, fake mustaches, theatrical putty to reshape the bridge of his nose. He began to scout targets in small towns across Idaho, Washington, and Montana. He looked for banks with minimal security, predictable schedules, and easy escape routes into the dense woods. He monitored police radio frequencies using a scanner he had bought, learning the response times of the local sheriffs. His first robbery was a threshold moment. He walked into a small bank in a sleepy town, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He was wearing a fake beard and a beanie. He pulled the Magnum from his coat pocket. "This is a robbery," he shouted, his voice cracking slightly before finding its steel. Nobody moves. He expected chaos. He expected a hero to try and stop him. Instead, he found total compliance. The tellers, terrified by the disheveled man with the hand cannon, emptied their drawers. Boyce walked out with thousands of dollars in cash. He got into his car, drove calmly out of town, and disappeared into the forest. The adrenaline rush was intoxicating. It was the same high he had felt smuggling the code books out of TRW, the thrill of being the smartest man in the room, the man who knew the secret. Over the next 18 months, Anthony Lester went on a tear. He robbed 17 banks across the Pacific Northwest. The media dubbed him the hole-in-the-wall gang bandit, assuming from the efficiency of the jobs that he must be part of a professional crew. They didn't know it was one man, a fugitive spy, acting out a desperate fantasy of survival. Boyce became a ghost haunting the highways of the Northwest. He used the money to upgrade his life. He bought better survival gear. He bought books on philosophy and aviation. And inevitably, the money fueled his oldest obsession, flight. Boyce began taking flying lessons at a small airfield in Port Angeles, Washington. He introduced himself to the instructors as a writer named Sean, who wanted to learn to fly for a book he was writing. He was a natural pilot. He bought a small single-engine plane with the proceeds from his robberies. His plan began to crystallize. He would rob enough banks to buy a faster, long-range aircraft. He would outfit it with extra fuel tanks. And then he would fly. He would take off and head west, across the Bering Strait to the Soviet Union, or perhaps north into the vast, unpolished wilderness of the Canadian Yukon. He spent his nights in his cabin studying aviation maps, calculating fuel loads and wind vectors, dreaming of the ultimate escape where no wall could hold him. But while Boyce was planning his flight, the dragnet was tightening. The U.S. Marshal Service was under immense pressure from Washington, D.C., to catch the spy. The failure to locate him was becoming a political liability for the Carter and then Reagan administrations. Inspector Larry Homnick, the marshal leading the hunt, was drowning in bad intelligence. He had psychics calling him with visions of Boyce in Brazil. He had tourists reporting sightings in Paris and London. The marshals were chasing a phantom, looking for a sophisticated operative, while their target was eating canned beans in a shack in Idaho. But the weakness of every fugitive is isolation. Humans are social animals. Even Christopher Boyce, the misanthrope who preferred birds to people, needed to talk. In the bars of Bonner's Ferry, and later Port Angeles, Anthony Lester began to emerge from his shell. The alcohol loosened his tongue. He befriended local roughnecks, loggers, and small-time criminals. He started hanging out with a man named Mike, a drifter who didn't care about Lester's past, but enjoyed his generosity with the bank robbery cash. In these drunken sessions, Boyce would let his guard down. He would rant about politics. He would talk about the CIA, about the hegemony of the American empire, about the corruption of the system. He used words that didn't fit the profile of a mountain man. He had a strange, burning intensity in his eyes that unsettled people. He wasn't just a drifter. He was a man carrying a burden too heavy for one set of shoulders. The break in the case didn't come from a satellite sweep or a wiretap. It came from a hamburger. In August 1981, the marshals received a tip from a witness to one of the bank robberies in Washington state. The witness described a robber not just by his disguise, but by his mannerisms, a certain stiffness, a specific way he held his head. A sharp-eyed marshal in Seattle looked at the description and then looked at the wanted poster of Christopher Boyce. He had a hunch. They started canvassing the local hangouts in Port Angeles, showing the photo of the clean-cut Boyce to bartenders and waitresses. Most people shook their heads. They didn't know any college kids. They only knew the bearded drifters who came in for cheap beer. But on August 21st, 1981, a team of marshals walked into the Pit Stop, a drive-in restaurant famous for its greasy burgers. They showed the photo to a waitress. She frowned, wiping her hands on her apron. She looked at the photo, then she looked out the window. "He looks kind of like the guy who eats here," she said. "He's weird. He always reads books about flying." The marshals felt the electric charge of a live wire. When was he last here? They asked. The waitress pointed to the parking lot. "He's here right now," she whispered. "He's sitting in his car, eating a burger." The marshals moved with tactical speed. They exited the back of the restaurant, weapons drawn, circling the beat-up sedan parked in the lot. Inside the car, Christopher Boyce was eating a hamburger and reading a paperback book. He was lost in the story, momentarily forgetting the point, .357 Magnum under his seat or the sawed-off shotgun in the trunk. He was weeks away from disappearing forever. He had the plane. He had the maps. He was ready to go. But then he looked up. He saw the reflection of a man with a gun in his side mirror. He turned his head and saw the barrels of service revolvers pointed at his face through the glass. In that split second, the geometry of his life collapsed again. The open sky he had dreamed of was replaced by the hard lines of a gun barrel. Boyce didn't reach for his weapon. He didn't try to start the car. He did something that confused the marshals for a moment, something that spoke to the utter exhaustion of his 19 months on the run. He took one last, defiant bite of his hamburger. He chewed it slowly, savoring the taste of the last meal of a free man. Then he placed the burger on the dashboard, raised his hands, and smiled a tired, wry smile. "You got me," he said, his voice quiet and resigned. "I'm Chris." As they dragged him out of the car and slammed him against the hot metal of the hood, the marshals realized they weren't holding a monster. They were holding a scruffy, exhausted intellectual who looked more like a graduate student on a camping trip than the most wanted spy in America. But the contents of his car told the true story. The flight maps, the survival gear, the weapons, the cash from the bank robberies. It was the kit of a man who had declared war on the world and lost. The Falcon was grounded. The flight was over. And this time, the cage that awaited him would have no shadows, no drainage ditches, and no escape. The system he had mocked had finally closed its fist around him. The second capture of Christopher Boyce in the parking lot of the pit stop drive-in marked the definitive end of the Falcon's flight and the beginning of a burial that would last for decades. The federal judicial system, humiliated by his escape and terrified by his 18-month bank robbery spree, had no interest in rehabilitation or mercy. The judge threw the book at him with a force intended to shatter any hope of future freedom. On top of his original 40-year sentence for espionage, Boyce was given an additional 25 years for bank robbery. But the numbers on the docket were less significant than the destination stamped on his transfer papers. Boyce was designated a high-security risk and sent to the United States Penitentiary in Marion, Illinois. In the early 1980s, Marion was the end of the line, the replacement for Alcatraz, a facility designed to contain the men the system had deemed uncontrollable. For the next 2 decades, Christopher Boyce lived in a concrete box. He was placed in the control unit, a regime of permanent solitary confinement where inmates spent 23 hours a day locked in cells the size of a parking space. There were no windows to the outside world, no birds to watch, no sky to dream about. There was only the hum of fluorescent lights that never truly went dark, and the echoing screams of other men losing their minds. In the silence of the hole, the intellectual arrogance that had fueled his treason in Palos Verdes was ground down into a fine gray dust. He had no audience for his theories on geopolitics anymore. He was just another number in the darkest corner of the American gulag. While Boyce rotted in Marion, his partner, Andrew Daulton Lee, was fighting a different war in the federal penitentiary system. The Snowman had been stripped of everything. The swaggering drug dealer, who had once demanded thousands of dollars from the KGB, had become a frightened, lonely man. Lee spent 20 years filing endless appeals, claiming that his confession in the Mexican basement had been coerced by torture, that the evidence was tainted, that he was merely a patsy for Boyce's genius. But the government remained unmoved. In the cold calculus of the law, Lee was the mercenary. He was the courier who had physically handed the keys to the kingdom to the enemy, not for ideology, but for heroin. He languished in prison, balding, broken, and largely forgotten by the world, a ghost haunting the corridors of the federal system. But while the men faded into the misery of prison life, their story took on a strange, vibrant afterlife in the cultural consciousness. In 1979, journalist Robert Lindsay published The Falcon and the Snowman, a book that dissected their crimes with a nuance that made the establishment uncomfortable. It painted Boyce and Lee not as cartoon villains, but as tragic figures, misguided products of a cynical age, kids who had stumbled into a game they didn't understand. Then, in 1985, Hollywood came calling. Director John Schlesinger adapted the book into a major motion picture, casting Timothy Hutton as the brooding, idealistic Boyce and Sean Penn as the manic, desperate Lee. The movie was a massive hit. This pop culture fame created a bizarre, cruel dissonance for the men inside. Boyce later described the surreal experience of sitting in a prison recreation cage, shackled, watching a movie about his own youth on a small black-and-white television. He saw actors reenacting his life, making his crimes look edgy and romantic, while he lived the grim, gray reality of the consequences. The fame made him a target. Other inmates wanted to hurt the famous spy to make a name for themselves. The guards watched him with extra scrutiny, convinced that the man who had escaped Lombok was constantly plotting another breakout. The movie immortalized their youth, but it did nothing to shorten their sentences. They remained frozen in amber, the eternal 20-year-olds of the Cold War, while their real bodies aged and withered in captivity. The world outside the prison walls changed with a speed that Boyce and Lee could not comprehend. The Berlin Wall fell. The Soviet Union, the evil empire they had served, collapsed into dust. The Rylite satellites they had compromised were decommissioned, replaced by digital networks, fiber optics, and drones. The secrets they had stolen became historical footnotes, declassified and filed away in dusty archives. The Cold War ended, but the prisoners remained. It wasn't until 1998, after 21 years behind bars, that the door finally cracked open for the Snowman. Andrew Daulton Lee was granted parole. The man who walked out of prison was unrecognizable. The frantic energy of the drug addict was gone, replaced by the quiet shuffle of a broken man. He returned to California, but the Palos Verdes of his youth was gone. He moved into a halfway house, got a quiet job, and faded into total obscurity. He died in 2008, a lonely end for the man who once thought he was a player in the great game of nations. Christopher Boyce had to wait longer. His escape and bank robberies made him a hard case, and the parole board was terrified that if they let him out, he would fly again. It wasn't until September 2002, after serving 25 years, that the Falcon was finally released. He emerged into a post-9/11's world that was alien to him. He had gone to prison in the age of disco and typewriters. He came out in the age of the internet and terror wars. He was a middle-aged man with no career, no money, and a notorious name. But Boyce did what he had always done. He adapted. He moved to Oregon, seeking the quiet of the wilderness, far away from the suburbs that had suffocated him. He married, and in a poetic return to his origins, he went back to the birds. He resumed falconry, spending his days in the wet fields of the Pacific Northwest, looking up at the sky, training hawks to hunt. In the few interviews he gave, the fire of his youth was replaced by a deep, weary regret. He admitted that his whistleblowing was arrogance. He admitted that he hadn't saved the world. He had just destroyed himself. The personal tragedy of Boyce and Lee is compelling, but the true legacy of their crime is written in the architecture of American security. The betrayal at TRW fundamentally changed the way the United States protects its secrets. Before the Falcon and the Snowman, the defense industry operated on a gentleman's code. If you were from a good family, if you had a clean record, and if you looked like a patriot, you were trusted. Background checks were cursory. Security inside the vaults was lax, because it was assumed that one of us wouldn't betray the team. Boyce shattered that illusion forever. He proved that the insider threat doesn't look like a villain in a trench coat. It looks like the kid next door. It looks like the quiet clerk reading a book. It looks like the son of an FBI agent. Because of Christopher Boyce, the Personnel Reliability Program was overhauled across the entire Department of Defense. Today, anyone with a top-secret clearance is subject to continuous, invasive monitoring. Their finances are tracked to spot sudden wealth. Their travel is logged. They are subject to random drug tests and polygraphs that ask uncomfortable questions about loyalty and lifestyle. The two-person rule, which requires two authorized individuals to be present whenever a secure vault is opened or classified material is handled, became mandatory in communication centers worldwide. The idea that a single clerk could be left alone with the nuclear codes, as Boyce was, is now unthinkable. The casual culture of the Black Vault, with its daiquiris and pot parties, was eradicated, replaced by biometric scanners, cameras, and a culture of institutional paranoia. The case also served as a brutal lesson in the fragility of high technology. The Rylite satellite was a masterpiece of engineering, a billion-dollar ear in the sky that represented the pinnacle of American science. It was protected by the most advanced encryption math could provide, and yet it was defeated by a cheap Minos camera and a drug addict who needed cash for heroin. It proved that you can build an impenetrable fortress. You can surround it with fences and guards, but if the person holding the key is unhappy, the fortress will fall. The vulnerability was not in the software. It was in the wetware. It was in the human heart. In the end, the story returns to the Paseo de la Reforma in Mexico City. It returns to that singular, chaotic moment on January 6, 1977. The entire machinery of the Cold War, the satellites, the missiles, the spy agencies, was pivoting on a razor's edge. If Andrew Daulton Lee had waited 5 more minutes for his handler to appear, history might have been different. If he hadn't thrown that piece of paper through the fence. If the Mexican police officer had been looking the other way, or if he had simply decided it wasn't worth the paperwork to arrest a gringo litterbug. If any of those variables had shifted, the Soviet Union might have continued to read the CIA's mail for another decade. The U.S. might have entered the critical years of the 1980s, completely blind to Soviet missile capabilities. The strategic balance of the world might have shifted, but the officer did cross the street. He did his job. Not because he knew about satellites or geopolitics, but because he enforced the law on his beat. He arrested a man for acting suspiciously, and in doing so, he pulled a thread that unraveled a conspiracy. Today, the Rylite satellites are space junk, drifting in the silent graveyard orbit. The Soviet Union is a memory. The Black Vault is empty, but the lesson remains. In a world of high-tech surveillance and digital warfare, the most dangerous variable is still the human element. Christopher Boyce tried to fly above the corrupted world of men, to be like the Falcon detached, pure and free. But he forgot that even falcons have to land. And when they do, the trap is waiting. The story of the Falcon and the Snowman isn't a spy thriller. It is a tragedy about the loss of innocence, a reminder that the fate of nations can rest in the trembling hands of a junkie on a street corner, waiting for a signal that never comes.